on biodiversity of grasslands. I am Kirsty Top, based at SRUC. I would firstly like to thank our funders, the BGS, the BSAS and the Stapleton Trust for this event. In terms of housekeeping, please can you make sure you keep your mics off and your cameras off to help with bandwidth. And we are using the chat function for asking questions, so please put your questions in the chat. Towards the end of the session, Professor Maggie Gill, Chair of the Stapleton Trust, will facilitate the discussion sessions based on these questions. At the webinar last week, Lisa Norton used evidence from the Countryside Survey in 2007 to show that legume and herb content of grasslands has declined. Robin Pakeman then went on to highlight the importance of mosaics of habitats is required to maximise the biodiversity. And our final speaker last week was Will Peach, who set out how lenient grazing and ryegrass seed set options could enhance the number of rare breed species. Tonight, we are focusing on the implementation of how policy and practice could reverse the biodiversity decline. Our first speaker is Claire Pinches, Principal Science Analyst at Natural England. She has been actively monitoring and evaluating, designing and delivering agri-environment schemes. Tonight, she will present on the topic development of policies to conserve and increase the biodiversity in grasslands. Claire, could you share your screen?
Oh, yes, hi, can you hear me, everybody?
Yes, thanks.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction, Kirsty. Yes, hi, everybody, and many thanks for inviting me to contribute to this mini webinar series. I work as Principal Scientific Analyst within Natural England's Chief Scientist Directorate. And whilst my work's currently focused on all things woodland and ensuring NE's work in support of the government's tree targets is fully evidence-based, until very recently I worked as one of Natural England's national grassland specialists. And in that role, I provided advice on the protection, management and restoration of species-rich grasslands. I also worked alongside Steve Peel, who chaired last week's session on the design and delivery of agri-environment schemes, including development and managing DEFRA-funded grassland research and monitoring projects. So, oh, hang on, sorry about that. Hopefully my talk will complement those given last week, and in particular, Will Peach's, which described the development and implementation of options designed to restore populations of seed-eating birds and pollinating insects on pastoral farms, and looked at how successful these had been. My talk focuses on those kind of jewels in our crown, really, the really species-rich, wildflower-rich grasslands, and those options aimed at restoring and recreating those. So I'm going to talk first about the importance of species-rich grasslands very briefly, the key science underpinning scheme options designed to manage, restore and recreate those, and look at what scheme monitoring tells us about their effectiveness in improving the condition of priority grasslands and increasing the resource. And finally, how might future schemes be improved to deliver more for species-rich grassland and their associated wildlife? What can we learn from what's happened in the past to basically make future schemes fit for addressing the biodiversity crisis? So why the focus on species-rich grasslands? Well, as Lisa mentioned last week, just 2% of the UK's total grassland area is species-rich grassland, and that's as a consequence of very significant dramatic losses due to agricultural intensification and specialisation since the Second World War. Despite the fact that they only cover 2% of total grassland area, they sustain the vast majority of grassland biodiversity, and that's across taxonomic groups. So not just the rarities, but also the widespread decliners which have been lost, the widespread declining species which have been lost from the landscape. They were once common, but now they're on quite a steep decline often. And that reflects converts to 58% of conservation priority species, those species which are conservation priority in lowland farmland. And not only are these grasslands important for wildlife, but they also provide many critical ecosystem services which we all depend on, for example, pollination. And really, The rationale for their conservation was set out very well by John Lawton in his review in 2010. He looked at he reviewed the effectiveness of the protected site series in determining whether it was fit for purpose for the future, particularly under climate change. And he found that most sites, and this includes grassland sites, were small and isolated, sitting within an intensely managed matrix, which was hostile for nature. And even when protected, this critical core wasn't coherent. It couldn't sustain itself or halt further decline. So he came up with a slogan: we need more, bigger, better, and more joined up in order to basically address biodiversity decline. So I'm going to go into the next bit of my talk, talking about the programme of work really over quite a long period to really understand how to do this, how to restore and recreate species-rich grassland. I'm giving it an Anglo-centric view, as all the findings I'm presenting are from the English schemes. So I'm not covering those in the devolved administrations, and that's because that's my experience. So classic schemes, and this gives a bit of a timeline, and you can see that the classic schemes, countryside stewardship, the original countryside stewardship scheme, and the environmental sensitive area schemes, they had they were embarked on in the late 80s, and whilst they had high uptake, they were relatively unambitious in their environmental objectives. Grassland creation and arable reversion options were mainly aimed at landscape and not biodiversity really, and they also had rigid prescriptions. And really, whilst there'd been some ad hoc research then focused on grassland restoration, for example, Terry Wells at Monkswood and Charlie Gibson at Whiteham, the advent of a dedicated programme of research and monitoring to support the schemes only really started, in the late 90s, well, the mid 90s, sorry. And that really heralded the start of significant improvements in our understanding of what works and what doesn't with regard to grassland restoration and recreation. So there were two big phases of that in the mid to late 90s, and then from the late 90s to the early 2000s. And that really meant that when environmental stewardship was launched, it was built on a wealth of experience and extensive evidence. And countryside stewardship, the scheme which is available now, that really is built on that similar evidence base. So what did all that evidence tell us? Well, in terms of what it told us about key constraints, there were really four. So residual soil fertility, high soil phosphorus limits the restoration success of trying to restore species-rich grassland, though it may represent a complex suite of soil factors. Secondly, a lot of sites are seed limited, and that reflects on the absence of target species, both in the soil seed bank or within the immediate landscape, enabling them to disperse in and establish at those target sites. So there's limited capacity for enhancement based on what's there already. Also a lack of gap opportunities, gap limitation within the sward. As you can see from the bottom picture, the swards are quite closed generally. So there's limited opportunity to seed germination and establishment. And also, finally, some species are more difficult to establish than others. There's some recalcitrant species, and those tend to be the really quite specialist species, which are associated with low nutrient sites and tend to be quite small in size. But the good news is that we, through the research programme, found a lot of solutions that basically these constraints could be overcome if you target the schemes well to low P sites or environmentally stressed situations. But in order to achieve change over the lifetime of an agreement, i.e. less than 10 years, that typically we need to do something proactive. We need to be interventionist. And first we need to basically create the establishment opportunities within the sward by creating disturbance, and then typically proactively introduce seed by spreading green hay, for example, or sowing wildflower seed. And we can also use techniques to reduce competition, for example, the introduction of yellow rattle, which is a hemiparasite. So we learned an awful lot. And we use that in terms of setting the guidance that was used for environmental stewardship, in particular higher level stewardship. That scheme was more ambitious in improving quality of outcomes. It was designed to be more flexible whilst still constrained by the control and verification rules. It encouraged a more tailored approach at the field scale, and we also committed to regular aftercare. And the uptake of those options was very significant, actually, the key grassland options within that scheme, with more than £180 million spent on those. So you can see all those things together contributed to something that was quite a big step up, really, from what had happened before. So what now looking at what that actually delivered on the ground, our monitoring, we've got various monitoring programs and monitoring of 180 whole agreements for a stratified random sample, which was baseline surveyed in 2009 and then went back to 7 years later, showed that of the maintenance option, the species rich grassland maintenance option, species richness had increased in the majority of those parcels, most frequently in lowland meadows and other grassland types. And the restoration option, HK7, species richness had increased on more parcels than it had decreased. So a little bit more of a variable result there, most likely to increase where supplementary options were used, i.e. there was more proactive and targeted management. So in terms of the change in grassland condition in species-rich grasslands, and I should say that by condition, we mean conditions assessed using a short set of attributes, for example, cover of coarse grasses, cover of trees and shrubs, and most importantly, the number and frequency of positive indicator species, those target wildflower species that we so critically need to get back. And this graph shows, and blue is the best condition and grey is poorest, that at baseline, the expectation really was that very little within this grassland maintenance option should have been in the grey condition. And you can see the poorest condition, you can see that it is actually, there's quite a bit in there, which was a bit of a surprise. And you can see that at resurvey, more of the poor condition sites moved into good condition, which is good, but perhaps there should have been less of the grey to start with. And in the grassland restoration option, you can see that whilst again, more sites have moved into the best condition, the blue category on the resurvey, there's still quite a lot really in condition C, and that indicates quite a high degree of inertia following 7 years in the scheme. So that's not quite where we'd want it to be perhaps. Going on to some more focused monitoring of these grasslands, again, reporting a random sample of these options that were sampled, first in 2007 when they'd only just gone in, and then 7 years later. Grasslands in the restoration option, a broadly similar pattern. 23% had improved, almost 2/3 had stayed the same, and 11% had in fact declined, which is not something we were wanting to see clearly. And the possible reasons for that lack of progress were, we found in looking at the data that 27% had soil phosphorus index of 2 or higher, so they had been perhaps wrongly targeted to sites with a low capacity really for restoration. And furthermore, really there hadn't been sufficient management intervention implemented under the agreement to really allow a restoration of species richness. So 81% hadn't received seed or green hay. There's a question about whether this was teething problems. It was early on in the scheme, and perhaps people hadn't got to grips with what was really required, but certainly some cause for concern there. And what about grasslands entered, or land entered into the grassland creation, arable reversion side of things? Well, this fares a bit better. 33% met the threshold for priority habitat, which meant actually they would qualify 8 years down the line as priority grassland of conservation interest. 17% were in the best condition, and a further 30% met the threshold for semi-improved grassland. So they were heading in generally the right direction. This reports findings of a non-random sample, but advisors were nominated. Advisors were asked to nominate the most successful sites they knew of. And really, we wanted to establish what could happen if all things went well. And this really shows some of the success stories that are possible. So we know it can work, but why doesn't it really? We know the evidence, we know the science base is right, and we know that it can work. So I wanted to just talk a little bit, getting towards the end of the talk, about some exploration that ENI and DEFRA did to basically examine why there wasn't more widespread success and look into means of making environmental stewardship more effective. That joint report made a series of recommendations, 66 recommendations in total, and these covered better agreement setup, the need for better QA, in-house monitoring of quality, and increased peer review, and also finally better aftercare. Regular visits are essential to assess progress, feedback to the agreement holder, and enable adaptive management. Ideally, 5% with an experienced colleague. And related to that, some further work was done, really, monitoring and evaluation work, funded again by DEFRA, to look at the influence of advice, support and engagement on scheme outcomes. And that found that agreement quality and outcomes were improved when there was regular contact between advisor and agreement holder and a commitment for continuity of advice. But you can see there in the bracketed text, in 7 years, only 24% of agreements had actually kept the same advisor, and 23% had 3 or more advisors. So that churn creates can create a lack of confidence. So providing feedback to agreement holders is really important and influential in influencing outcomes and really keeping that engagement about being on a common journey. So I've talked a bit about the conventional approach to scheme management following prescriptions. I thought I'd just give you a bit of insight into the findings of a different approach, the payment by results trial, which is the Grassland part of that has been taking place in Wensleydale. And it was first funded by the EU, and the second stage has been funded under the ELM Tests and Trials Programme, DEFRA funded. And that's enabled more land to be brought in to provide insights into scalability. It gives 5 years worth of data. This approach is different. You're probably relatively, you may well be familiar with it now. It's been discussed in various fora, but it's no prescriptions. The payments linked to delivery of the outcomes, and assessment of the outcome is based on evidence. So as I said, the Wensleydale trial is being co-delivered by Natural England and also Yorkshire Dales National Park. And it's looking at options for hay meadow restoration and to provide habitat for breeding waders. So what have we learnt so far from this trial? Obviously, we're not the whole way through. Well, it's been approached by the parties. It's been an approach which has been embraced by the participants, with 94% choosing to continue under the DEFRA test and trial extension. And what's really interesting, I think, is that even in a short period of time, the environmental results have been very positive to compared to the control sites, which have been in countryside stewardship or ES. Self-assessments, which are made by the farmers to basically track progress, have been very accurate, and they've generally showed close concurrence with the Natural England and Yorkshire Dales National Park advisor scores. And I think the risk of failure has provided a real focus to apply management skills. And we know from feedback that grassland farmers were making conscious decisions on managing the payment by results fields in a way that would improve the results. For example, cutting hay fields later, for example, to enable the wildflowers to set seed. So continuation will allow us to see whether these trends are sustained in the longer term, and whether that difference between the payment by results agreements and the control agreements holds fast. We found it was difficult to eliminate some of the weather effects from the scoring systems, but the actual impact was not perhaps as great as the perceived risk. And this is actually quite a training heavy approach, but that training has been very well received and been judged to be a kind of learning journey that enhanced appreciation of the environmental assets. There's also been a strong sense of fairness about this approach, mixed with a sense of pride and I think it's really drawn out a kind of competitive edge amongst those farmers who've taken part. So it's certainly had some advantages. So really, in my conclusions, in terms of key messages for the development of new schemes, including that one, the English Environmental Land Management scheme being developed currently, I'd say, well, for grasslands, we have excellent, well-evidenced techniques to restore, create and recreate species-rich grassland. But to address the biodiversity crisis and transform the fortunes of our wildlife, our farm and wildlife, these need to be implemented well and at scale. And to understand the reasons for scheme success and failure, we need to understand the detail of delivery, how well schemes are being delivered. At their best, agri-environment schemes can work really well and perhaps could be improved by a payment results approach or element of that. But of whatever scheme we have, success will need to be well informed, will rely on well-informed land managers, trusted advisors, and good QA and good aftercare. So that's all I really wanted to end on. But to say thank you to the various people who've been involved in the DEFRA R&D programme, and to my colleagues at Natural England, and indeed involved in the payment by results trial at the Yorkshire Dales National Park. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. We have time for one quick question. And you've been asked, on which criteria did you focus when you were looking at, say, improved grassland? Was it species richness or rare species richness, or was there an indicator species?
In improving species-rich grassland, in restoring, we largely focused in this work on the botanical species richness and suites of indicator species that are indicative of good quality grassland.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on, can I remind you all to put your questions in the chat function? That would be great. Thank you. Moving on, we now have Ian Boyd, who is a farmer from the Cotswolds, and he's going to tell us about his journey from farming arable monocultures to now farming wildflower and diverse grasslands. Ian, can you share your screen?
Yep. Are we seeing it now?
I'm not.
I'm not. Yes. Is that right?
No.
No.
That's it now. Thank you very much,
We're
Ian.
there now?
Yes.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Great. Hello, this is all about a profitable farm rich in wildlife. And the message I want to get across is that given the right motivation, farmers can create biodiverse grasslands from virtually wherever they start from. This is our story and our motivation about how we got there, and also about nature's power of recovery. We farm about 300 hectares high up in the Cotswold Hills. I was trained as a conventional farmer, and I spent 25 years in mostly intensive monoculture arable cropping. But I will admit to a bit of an obsession in wildlife photography. And I've traveled many parts of the globe photographing wildlife, and this disconnect between what I was doing at home and my interest in photography was always there. And I think we joined a lot of the environmental stewardship schemes that the previous speaker has been outlining, but it was really with the advent of higher level stewardship that I saw an opportunity to put this thing back into balance. I will admit initially it was probably more of a financial decision, but the problem or the good thing about wildlife is that it really gets hold of you and it's infectious. And the more you do of it, the more you see of it, the more you want to do it. This was a journey for us. There was no sudden moment when it sort of all happened, but it's a system of, we wanted to change to a system of low input mixed farming, and creating grasslands from our arable was very much part of it. So we followed three sort of basic principles. Firstly, the grassland went organic to get organic certification. And it wasn't until another 7 years later until all the arable got certification as well. But that was quite a leap at the time of not knowing how it was all going to work. Then in 2012, the Pasture for Life group came along and we looked at their systems and we thought, well, hang on, we do all that anyway. It's interesting, the founding principles of the PFLA to respect nature, encourage farming as if in a conversation with nature, and to highlight the role of biodiverse pastures and managing grazing and supporting wholly pasture-fed livestock and encouraging biodiversity. So, you know, all the sort of the things that I like were there. And we also started doing regenerative farming with the regenerative agriculture principles, which I will explain more in a moment. So we've sort of developed 4 different types of grassland. I'm not letting my pictures on, am I? Do we have the next picture?
No. Yes, we do now.
Right, great. We have 4 different types of pasture. We created the permanent pasture, which is more of the heavy clay type of soils on steep banks with wet areas that weren't suitable. This is heavier land. We're not getting quite the biodiversity that we are elsewhere, but it's, you know, it's all looking quite good. Then we created quite a lot of wildflower meadows from the arable. This is our very best one, and is probably what's sort of most relevant here. This actual field was set aside for 12 years, and so that probably gave it a head start. And it wasn't when we started joining the high level stewardship scheme, we suddenly realized what we've got with these sort of meadows. It was interesting, Lisa Norton last week was saying that the calcareous grassland only represented 0.2% of the UK arable area, quite small. But I suppose as a Cotswold boy, it's all I've ever known. And it's interesting, this field, we're just changing from higher level stewardship to mid-tier countryside stewardship. And so we've had it assessed and we came out with 45 different species on it. We've actually created 65 hectares of these wildflower meadows, and they've all been assessed now, and they've all, some of them after just 15 years, they've all joined the priority habitat index, and they're now all on the magic map. So they've all gone into countryside stewardship under the species rich grassland options. Anyway, you get a selection of species throughout the years. Here we have the sort of the cowslips in the early springtime. And another valuable thing is that obviously we're cutting very late cut hay. This because we have a lot of cows, we have a lot of use for this hay. A lot of people don't have a use for mature hay. Well, with our system, with the cows outside wintered all the time, it's a product which we use. We've also got sort of about 70 hectares of herbal ley. This is part of our arable rotation. The regenerative grazing part of it is called tall grass grazing. And so here we're trying to let it grow tall. It doesn't always look this good. And sometimes the crops don't get away quite this. But when we've got masses of growth, it's really quite easy to manage. We move the cattle every day onto a new patch. And this means that we're getting if you consider that whatever the top growth you have about half the root growth underneath. You're getting a large root growth, which is all helping improve the soil. We also grow about 50 hectares of arable crops, which we grow after as part of the rotation after this. And almost the sad thing is that that's what pays better, which is not how it should be. But I mean, it's the adage that you use the fertility building phase and then you cash in on the arable phase. This is the sort of moving every day when they're looking on, and actually as a method of management, you're watching the cattle trot through every day. You can monitor them all very easily. We've also got 4 hectares of orchard which we graze as well. This is sort of agroforestry, or could be adapted for rewilding, but this sort of system of moving the cattle on through quickly all works very well. So what are the outcomes that we've had from this system? Main thing is, certainly the arable side, is the improvement in the soil. On the right, we have the herbal ley, where we've got the soil stability. On the left, we have conservation headlands around every field, which we plough every springtime, where we disturb them. This is being dropped under countryside stewardship. But you can just see quite clearly the stability of the soil. It isn't there, and the increase in the organic matter from that. There's also, obviously, this improves the purity of the water leaving the farm. We've got a sort of an drain outflow at the bottom of the valley, where every now and then we do litmus tests of to measure the nitrogen and the phosphate contents, and it always comes out clear. And there's always those interesting comparisons. So I go the other side of the stream, so I test it where it is coming from another farm. And you watch at certain times of the year how the papers all go bright purple, and that's indicative that our sort of pollutant levels coming out of our outflow are low. The other issue is to do with the carbon footprint. So we use the farm carbon cutting toolkit to assess what our carbon footprint is. And the basic principle is that if you're organic, in other words, you're not using any nitrogen fertilizer, if you're pasture for life, so you're not buying any grain, you don't need an arable area to support it. And if you're using regenerative agricultural techniques, you're developing the root growth and not disturbing the soil too much, you really should be somewhere net zero, maybe even sequestration, depending a bit on how much hedgerows and trees you have. My biggest sin is that I plough the herbal leys up to grow the arable crops. But as I said, unfortunately, at the moment, that is the phase which still pays. So what wildlife have we got? So this is a dung beetle. We do try as far as possible, we try to avoid using any insecticides or wormers with insecticidal properties with the cattle. Recently, we found some rugged oil beetles in one of our wildflower meadows that we created for 15 years. This is associated with the solitary mining bee, and they're indicative of older pastures, and that's just after 15 years. We get the odd rarity. This is the Duke of Burgundy fritillary butterfly. We got a small colony on the farm. Skylark numbers have rocketed. Here's a skylark nest in one of our wildflower meadows. Certainly this time of year, if we drive over the stubble fields, sometimes we can get up to 50 birds all shooting in the air. And we've also, obviously, our vole numbers have increased. We've got 3 main types of owls, the little owl, the tawny owl, and the barn owl here, as well as the sort of red kites and lots of buzzards and kestrels and sparrowhawks. I accept we've probably got too many hares and deer. They're lovely, but they're lovely for me to photograph, so we tolerate them. We've also, on the farm, we interact with a lot of people. Here we are doing the apple picking session. The tourists we bring onto the farm tours we do. So there's a lot of social interaction we do. Obviously with the pandemic, that's being curtailed at the moment, but that will pick up rapidly. We also sell the beef. This year, for the first time, we think we will be selling all our beef direct. This needs determination and skills not taught at agricultural colleges, but it's quite doable, and especially now that there has never been more interest in the provenance of food. But we're getting more and more, the scope for tourism is here. And hopefully, we can see in the future developing a lot of tourist facilities around the farm based on this. So, what are the hurdles to overcome? Well, the public goods created needs recognition and rewarding in elms. And it's been notable that so far there's been virtually no interaction between the organic and pasture-fed movement with DEFRA. There's a lot of new entrants coming in to farming, be it from a lot of people in the city who've given up their jobs and want a rural life, buying a small patch, to the pop stars buying complete estates. And there's a huge amount of interest in them in this sort of farming. I think you've only got to go to events like the Oxford Real Farming Conference or Groundswell to see the massive amount of interest in there. And I think probably just as well the Oxford Real Farming Conference was online this year, because there's no way they could have had the number of people. The event couldn't have contained the number of people that attended. With existing farmers, that's going to be more of a challenge, because there's a sort of mindset change that if you've been taught in conventional farming, and this sort of farming represents something very different. It's not just production orientated, it's providing also those multiple benefits as well. But I've never yet met a farmer who isn't proud of any wildlife he has on the farm. So, I mean, this is really about low input farming, the organic pasture for life regenerative approach, and it provides a whole system that can deliver so many different solutions, from the environmental, the economic, and the social. And the biodiverse grasslands are an essential part of it. And for me, it gives me a lot more wildlife to photograph. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for that fabulous tour of your farm through your photographs. We have time for one quick question at the moment. Have you ever measured the soil carbon in your farm, and have you done it over 2 time points to see how that has changed with the farming practices that you've now adopted?
Yes, we have, but I haven't come up with a nice, clear, easy solution. We have a little problem in that our soils are very high in calcium carbonate, and when you use the loss and ignition test, the calcium carbonate also cooks. So I'd love to think we have 15% soil carbon, but sadly I know it's not true. The Dumas test is more accurate, it's more representative of it. But actually we do use the soil mentor test to look at the sort of the proxy measures, the worm counts, doing the visual assessment of soil structure, but that doesn't come out with nice, clear answers that we all want.
No, but it does tell you quite a lot about your soil health and fertility.
It does, yes. But it'd be lovely if I could say, oh, we've increased our soil organic matter percentage by 0.5% this year. That's a very difficult figure to get hold of. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Ian. Our final presenter tonight is Chris Clark, who is from Nethergill Association. Nature Means Business. And he's going to tell us about how the businesses might survive and thrive by delivering biodiversity and other public goods.
Thanks very much, Kirsty, and thanks very much to Claire and Ian for some two great presentations. I'm going to tackle this very much from a business approach, and I hope by the end of what I have to tell you, you will understand why what Ian is doing and what Claire is proposing actually works in a business sense. The two photographs you see in front of you, one on the left with the pond, is right at the top of the Yorkshire Dales, Upper Wharfdale. We farmed there from 2005 to 2020. And then we sold that in July last year and moved to the farm on the right, which is just south of Exmoor. We moved in there about 8 weeks ago. Now, my background is ag college, probably the same as Ian, then milking, and then farm manager, then farm tenancy, building a meat processing business, retrained in business management and marketing, bought a farm in the Yorkshire Dales. And then in 2016, started working with farmers, trying to conjecture how these farmers would work and plan for Brexit, subsequently COVID, of course. And we started off in Nidderdale with 28 farms. We then moved on to 43 total farms, and we've now reviewed nearly 80 farms. And not one of those farms has exhibited any other characteristics than the ones I'm going to talk to you about this evening. And what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is against what you've been taught, against the received wisdom, and is very much counterintuitive. So it's how farming practice can reverse biodiversity decline, and you do that by balancing food, farming, and nature. And that theme, that proposition, balancing food, farming, and nature, is going to reappear many times this evening. What if you're in business? If you're farming, you are in business. What are you trying to do? You're trying to do three things. You're trying to be profitable. You're trying to make a resilient business, particularly in this day and age, and you're trying to hand it on in a better state to the next generation. And it is that profitability element, that first aim, that should drive every single farm business. I was trained at college to drive production, to make the land work as hard as it could, no matter how many inputs were required. But what we've actually found is that a viable farm business will only be viable if it's in balance with nature. The photograph you see on the right-hand side, a hay meadow, won't be quite the same as Ian's. This is at 1,400 feet. This is one of the drier fields that we had on the farm. And this now had in 2020 about 25 to 30 species. Started off with 5 or 6. It took 5 years for it naturally to achieve this. So the aims are to be profitable, resilient, and to hand it on to the next generation by having a business that's in balance with nature. Where do we start from? This is another photograph of Upper Wharfdale, looking south towards, if you know the area, Grassland and Skipton area. And this is a managed landscape. It has been managed for several centuries, 400 years or more, maybe even longer. Okay, and what that means is that that landscape has become in equilibrium, a long-term equilibrium with nature. Nature has adapted to the farming techniques that have been around for centuries, and that only began to change. This equilibrium only began to be lost once we started adding in fertilizer and buying in purchase concentrates and variable costs like that. And so when you are in equilibrium with nature, pressing your outputs, driving production as we've been taught, driving production beyond the maximum sustainable output, what we call the MSO of a farm, does two things. It will reduce the profitability on the farm, and it will decapitalize the natural environment. I'll show you why this happens in a minute. But not only that, if you totally destock that farm, that will also result in a decapitalization of the natural assets. And that happens because when incomes are reduced, you're losing that equilibrium. You're not having the right amount of stock on that farm. This means that there is on every single farm, all the nearly 80 farms that we've been on, we have found a sweet spot for that farm business, a sweet spot between farm business and nature, where farming and nature coincide. The farm will be at its most profitable, and natural capital will be at its best. Now, I understand that you will be skeptical about this, but I repeat, we've found this on every single farm that we have done any reviews, and that's nearly 80. No one was more surprised than us to come to these findings and conclusions. And there's a reason for it. Certainly there's one of the reasons partly for it is this free issue. Well, what do I mean by free issue? Well, again, the photograph on the right-hand side has had no fertilizer. The sheep and the cattle on that farm, on our farm, had no bought-in feed, very, very, very little, the occasional bag of sugar beet. And that has come and grown at absolutely no cost. So grass for a livestock farm, and we're beginning to see the same concept in arable farming, grass is provided free issue, courtesy of nature. We get, as livestock farmers, free sunshine, free rain, free fertility, free grass. And what we haven't done as business people, nor has it been taught, is taken this free issue into account. And it's free because if you had to buy that, it would cost a farmer huge amounts of money. It makes a significant contribution to farm profitability. If you had to replace that grass growth, that energy, by buying in fertilizer or bought in feed, the cost would be huge. We get it for nothing. So without this free issue, farm businesses would be even less viable than they are now. And we need to start taking it into account. We need to start including it in the way we work out the viability of a farm business. Now, bit of economics. Now, what I've got is two schematics here, one here, one on the next slide. And these have been developed from the nearly 80 farm businesses that we've analysed, and we've taken ordinary tax accounts produced by a tax accountant and turned them into management accounts. And so what we have here is what I was taught at Silhain, it was actually, anybody who was in Silhain. This is a standard economic theory of the firm. And so what you have is your output volumes along the horizontal axis, revenue costs on the vertical axis. The revenue line is this green line going up through here. Your fixed costs, which remain static unless there's a step function change in your business. And then the purple line are your variable costs. Where your variable costs cross the revenue line is the break-even point. And beyond that is profits. And what I was taught, and it is still being taught now, is that you need to drive your volumes to drive your profits. So what we've actually got here are variable costs that have a linear relationship with the volumes and the output. And that implies that there are economies of scale that at some volume will be made, a profit will be made. What we can now say categorically is that this causes an imbalance in a managed landscape. And so one of the reasons that this regenerative approach to agriculture is beginning to work is that we're beginning to get back to a balanced managed landscape. Why does that work? Well, instead of having the other economic theory, we've got the economic realities on the farm. exactly the same chart, exactly the same fixed costs, but the variable costs I've only taken halfway along, and I've hatched and shaded the variable costs that appeared on the previous slide. Why have I done that? I've done that because in farming, variable costs do that. And I did not know this until about 18 months ago. There is a non-linear relationship between driving volumes and variable costs. And so there's a reason for it. What we've called this line here, between here and here, is PVCs, productive variable costs. And these are variable costs that work with nature. Between the line I just drawn on the left and the line I've drawn at the inflection point on the right is the free issue grass that comes down courtesy of nature in the form of sunshine, rain, fertility, and grass growth. And so you have in here your profitable area, but then what farmers do, I was one of them, we add corrective variable costs, CVC, corrective because they're correcting for the disadvantages in the hills particularly of elevation, precipitation, and maybe latitude, and lower down geology and soil type. And most of the farms that I have worked with, that we have worked with over the last 2 years, are here. They've been through this profitable phase here, tried to drive production upwards, and gone into loss making. So we have break even at X, we have break back at Y, but we have at this inflection point here, the MSO, the maximum sustainable output. That is the point at which the farm is at its most profitable, that point there. Okay, and so what we've got in actual fact is farms having their stocking rate somewhere up here, if I can draw a perpendicular line, and so they're in loss making. If I can take that further up, they're in loss making. What they need to do is to reduce their stocking rate towards MSO, and when that happens, your corrective variable costs come down, your fertilizers, your feeds, your overwintering, your extra vet and med costs, they come down, and you begin to get closer to the breakback point and to some sort of profitability. Now, we found that out about, I don't know, 14, 15 months ago. But in the last 6 months, we've also realized and found out through the evidence of these 80-odd farms that if your stocking rate is to the left of MSO, you need to get it to MSO, because if you do not have the right stocking rate, then the natural capital will deteriorate. So not only will natural capital deteriorate, your profitability as a farm business goes down as well. And I completely understand why you might be skeptical about this, but I repeat, balancing food farming and nature in this way, we have not had a single farm show any other characteristic than this when analysed in this particular way. And so we have a business model here which has non-linear variable costs, productive variable costs, PVCs, only incurred when working with nature, the naturally available grass, and we have corrective variable costs, CVCs, occurred trying to drive production, substituting for nature. And so we have a business model that is working with nature. It is creating an equilibrium in a managed landscape. We're trying to get to this inflection point here. And farms that have been working with us for a little while and have begun to use this method of farm management are finding that as they reduce their towards MSO, they get more cash, they're more profitable, they're more viable. But not only that, their management of the grassland, the sward, the grassland that's available begins to move this way as well. So, and the result of that is, on our farm at Nethergill, we began to get natural capital appearing in the same way that Ian's did in our hay meadows, not even knowing that orchids were there. So we had this natural capital, but we hear this word used an awful lot. It's a much used, in my view, term, but mostly ill-defined. If we're going to have any use for the term natural capital, we must define it. We must be able to measure it and value it, quantify it, and it must fit into our existing accounting conventions. If we can't measure natural capital, we cannot, as farmers, demand a revenue stream from the state. We have to be able to measure and value. And as I understand it, at the moment, there are no internationally approved measures of methodology of measuring natural capital and creating a value for it. So we create these hay meadows, and we get this nature's bounty. Natural capital gives us access to nature's bounty, this free issue. Sunshine, rain, fertility, grass, balancing food, farming, and nature. We get this free issue benefit, and these benefits have a real value. And because nature is giving us this value, we should treat it as a stakeholder in a farm business. We should put nature on the balance sheet. These squirrels began to arrive without any asking on our part when we began to reduce our stocking rate. Red squirrels began to arrive. We need to treat nature as a stakeholder, but because it's a stakeholder in a very different way, it doesn't demand that an interest payment or a dividend or a discount. It just gives us. We should be treating it in a really good way, looking after it, stroking it gently, bring it into the kitchen table. One of the people we work with now has, as their family partnership, an empty chair around the kitchen table which says nature on it. Farming strategies, how are we going to get to this? If we're going to get to optimal performance, we need as farmers to maximize and set prices. We don't do that. We can't do that very easily. We need to get our activities to MSO levels by cutting out our CVCs, our corrective variable costs, fertilizer, purchase feed, etc. And we need to maximize the benefit of natural capital by maximizing the availability of naturally available grass. And farmers who go down this route are by default improving the environment and also getting more naturally available grass out of their system. We need to reduce fixed costs. I haven't got time to talk about fixed costs tonight really, but 92% of the farms, of the 80 farms, did not cover their variable costs or their fixed costs before support. And we ought to be developing added value and branded products. We must, as farmers, invest time in business planning because we will get better nature as a result of that. And finally, if we go to MSO, the farm will be at its most profitable. Without profit, a business is sunk. It will maximize the natural capital. It will minimize the change imposed on the environment from year to year. And we will avoid the purchase of feedstocks and artificial fertilizers. And they will have consumed energy in their production and their delivery. And they will have used more energy to feed to our stock than we get out in calories. So finally, last point, if we go to MSO, if we get our stocking rates to MSO, livestock farming may well be in a position to deliver a net sub-zero carbon economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation on MSO. I've learnt a lot. You talked about improving the economic fortunes. So have you done a long-term monitoring of the farms that have taken up MSO, and how far have they moved to being more profitable?
So this is really new stuff, and it's taken us quite a long time to get enough evidence to show that what we are saying is valid. The farms that are beginning to adopt this approach have been going for probably a year or just a little bit longer than a year. There's one going a bit more than that. And they're beginning to see, as I've tried to explain, their NSO moving to the right. Their use of the naturally available grass is getting much more efficient. And there is nothing cheaper in producing meat, red meat, than something that has cost you nothing to feed.
Thank you very much, Chris. Moving on to the final speaker tonight, who is Drew McConnell, the British Grassland Society President, who will give us a 5-minute presentation.
Yep, thanks very much, Kirsty. Good evening, everybody. As Kirsty mentioned, I'm president of the British Grassland Society, and we're delighted to be involved with the BSAS and the Stapleton Trust in providing these webinars. It's a bit about the BGS. We're made up of researchers, people from the industry and farmers. And our role is to provide basically farmers with the information they need to farm in whatever system they desire, and that is covers a wide range of systems within our farmers. You know, and they need probably the knowledge and that to progress and allow them. We don't want to influence what way they farm, but to provide them with information so that they can do whichever manner they choose. And within our farmers, we have a wide range from intensive farmers right through to guys with herbal lays and species who are farming big areas of species-rich grassland. So we're trying to cater for all those. So some thoughts for the webinars tonight. You know, all our farmers, we live in the countryside. We all take pride in where we live. We take pride in the thriving landscape around us. And that includes both farming and the nature that's involved around us. You know, I'm getting on in years now, but I want to leave the farm in better shape, both environmentally and with a profit base as well, from what Chris was saying, for the next generation to take it forward as well. And I think most farmers will have that mindset to want to leave their farm in a better position going forward. And without realizing that many of our farms, or grassland farms, play a key role in habitat provision already. You know, we're talking about species-rich grassland, but even our more intensive farms, the hedgerows surrounding their fields, you know, we've all got corners or fields or small fields or steep banks, which aren't intensively farmed at all, and they provide a wide range of species. And certainly it applies on our own farm. You know, with steep banks, they never see a vehicle, never see fertilizer. And again, the habitat on those is completely different to the more intensively farmed areas. You know, with streams, rivers, farm buildings and all. Again, there's a wide range of habitats around those. And certainly in my years farming, I'm lucky to spend time, see the wide range of animals that appear at time to time, should it be vertebrates, invertebrates, mammals and all. It's wonderful to watch, and again, it gives farmers great satisfaction seeing that going on around them. But the principal role of farming, however, is to produce food, and I know Chris has talked about value-adding products and all, but where we come from in Northern Ireland here, 85% of our dairy products are exported out of this wee part of the UK. They are all sold on the commodity market, more or less. And again, we're competing with guys from all over the world. So we very much have to be profit-based, and that probably has led to an intensification over the years. But again, we still want to do this with an eye on the environment. You know, we all want to keep progressing. The challenges set in front of us. When I started farming, the environment was low down on the list of priorities, coming from all our farmers, coming from government, coming from wherever, but it is definitely moving up the ladder in terms now. And the issue with Brexit as well is it has put huge pressure on this wee part of the UK, both in getting food one way across the mainland and again into Europe. At one stage, we thought we were going to be in the best of both worlds, but it's not just looking that way at the minute. You know, we need to find solutions going forward to allow our farms to be productive, but also to provide the habitats that the general population wants to see, you know, and this is going to take a lot of consideration going forward. How best can we do this? And it's not one silver bullet, I feel. You know, there's a range of solutions have to be developed here, because farms are very different. Should be their soil type, their climate, their landscape, and not one size will fit all. And again, but each farm can improve its biodiversity. You know, we have the chances to introduce extra species into our grassland, should be herbal leaves, should be multi-species swards, whatever. But then there are other aspects, our hedgerows. You know, in the past on our own farm, our hedgerows were all probably very manicured, but now we've started to let them go 4 or 5 years without trimming. You know, provides a far bigger canopy. There's far more birds attracted to them, far more fruit on those hedges. And again, we're seeing squirrels, we're seeing other mammals running about as well. So it's, you know, the small things that we can do on our own farms, which maybe we've been doing for a while, and we don't realize the benefits to the environment of that. But importantly, I think all the farmers, as Chris mentioned, farmers are profit driven. If we don't have a profit, we can't survive. And everything we must do must generate a profit at the end of the year. But to increase biodiversity, what we pick up on, would like to see a more evidence-based strategy. You know, we need guidance from politicians, from whoever, but we also need the science behind this. You know, are we going down a path without where the research hasn't been done? And I suppose from a VGS point of view, or from my personal point of view, I would love to see more research being done into what aspects of the biodiversity will lead to more profit on my farm and other farms within our members. And again, just thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you all, and have enjoyed very much the presentations tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drew, for that. Can I now hand over to Maggie, who will chair the question and discussion session?
Thanks very much, Kirsty, and thanks to all the speakers. Again, four fascinating talks, and I think a lot of follow-on continuity from last week's talks as well. And I think there's three words that come across when you're trying to get this look at biodiversity alongside farming, or three that speak to me in particular: balance, trade-offs, and diversity. And diversity not being just biodiversity, but actually the diversity, as we've seen on the chat, that a lot of the heterogeneity of our farms, and how do we actually deal with that? We've heard a lot about income as well, and just to, as we go into that, just to get the speakers thinking as I come to each of them in turn to ask specific questions. The question of income for those not involved in farming directly, it would be good if someone could talk a bit more about that balance between the income from profit and the income that comes through the sort of payments from government for environmental services. But let me start by asking Claire to a specific question. And could all the speakers please turn on their cameras so that we can have a sort of looking a bit like a panel? Okay, great. So Claire, there was a bit of controversy. There's a bit of controversy in all of these. The controversy over organic farmers and the fact they're not getting. You're welcome to pick up on that, but I think that's just a insoluble problem by the look of the comments in the chat. What I was more going to focus on was, you mentioned about advisors and the need for continuity in advisors, and that some farms had 3 different advisors over a period of time. Are people looking at solutions to that? Is there a possibility of a mentor system as more and more farmers become expert and know what to do in this, and as we're all much better in terms of Zoom and contacting each other virtually, are there new ways? Can we take something positive, minimal, but out of coronavirus, about sort of saying, is there potential to make those connections better? And maybe also just touch on what happened. Can advisors still visit during lockdown or not? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I should, thanks very much, Maggie. I think I should make clear that I am not actively involved in development of the ELM scheme because of my current role. So I'm not able to answer questions on the development of that scheme really in relation to specific.
But you can speculate, and you can have a vision from your vast knowledge. You can make some suggestions and we can pass them on to those who are for you.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the importance of good advice, really, and developing a relationship, ideally. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's come out very, very strongly, really, from the monitoring and evaluation evidence that we picked up through more social science focused research. Having a trusted advisor who not only advises at the start of an agreement, but provides that advice, throughout its duration was important. So it's not just that initial investment, it's kind of a developing relationship, ideally throughout that journey, and it allows adaptive management. I mean, that doesn't necessarily need to be a Natural England person. There's a whole range of people out there who also provide advice. National parks, for example, have provided that in the payment by results trial, and obviously, act in that capacity as well. In terms of other modes, I mean, the value of peer-to-peer learning, I think, is also considerable, and there've been various studies done on that, as have been done on the kind of one-to-many kind of provision of advice as well. I think the ELM test and trials program is investigating quite substantially, the best means of providing advice for different elements of that scheme, as I understand it. So I think that's all being explored now. And in terms of using other platforms, I mean, we've all got very used to being online. I think probably that does free up, other opportunities other than meeting in person. So yes, I think there's plenty of scope. In terms of the ability of advisors to go out on farms now, my understanding, and I'm sure one of my Natural England colleagues on the chat will correct me if I'm wrong, is that is not possible for routine visits presently, but I may be wrong there. As I say, I'm not close to that side. Unfortunately, I'm not close to that side of the work at the moment, so I may be giving duff information. If so, somebody correct me, please. But I think it's more for emergencies because of the pandemic.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. And if someone can correct or confirm on the chat what's possible. But Drew, Jan drew attention to a BGS mentoring scheme. Can you tell us any more about that? Is there a role for the professional societies in this, in terms of helping individual farmers find their own solutions?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, definitely. I think just having, as I say, I think part of this is about developing relationships and feeling, having someone to enthuse you and to be able to bounce ideas off and to really check that what's happening to a sward is kind of following the right trajectory and making changes, and thinking about potential interventions if necessary if things are going a bit awry. So I think the role of a mentor could be really powerful and important there, definitely.
Great, thanks. Drew, do you want to add anything to that from the BGS point of view?
Yeah, well, Maggie, we have our grazing mentor scheme where we train up mentors and they relay their knowledge to other farmers who want to adopt or change systems to become where grazing is more of a focused area for their farm. And again, as Claire has mentioned there, peer-to-peer learning works really well in the farming community, and especially someone you can have at the end of the phone to talk to when things don't go as well as you would like them to. and with the various weather situations we get ourselves into in this part of the world, that happens quite often. And yeah, and it is working well. We have already had one program ran through, and it has worked well. And again, is that just the person you trust? You can pick up the phone and at any time and ask them, what should I do now? And it's good to have that information coming from someone who's been through it all and knows exactly the situation you're in.
Mm. Great, thanks. Moving on to Ian. Somebody put in the chat something about there being constrained, that grassland restoration being constrained by a lack of donor sites. Is that an issue?
Not in the Cotswolds. Certainly the Cotswold Conservation Board have been going around doing a lot of brush harvesting. We had it done last year and the year before. And I think that last year they had a very good season at it. So the grassland, it is available. It has to be said, when we first established our grass lays, we bought some expensive seed and we scattered on the ground in the autumn, and the following spring, nothing had come up. And so I'm going around tearing my hair out. This is a complete disaster. And we spread some old hay from the one wildflower site that we did have on the fields. And at the time I was very thankful nobody could see me racing up and down the fields, spewing this hay all over the fields. And even now, 15 years later, you can still see those stripes where the cowslips come up every year. You have to have an inordinate amount of patience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think patience is something we've talked about in previous webinars about changing the carbon in soil and things like that. But I was very taken by, I think it was Claire talking about seeing changes after 2 years in some of this. So some changes happen more quickly, but you obviously have patience and an end point. So we talked about value, but then there's value in terms of money, but then there's also the value for you in terms of having the subjects for your wildlife photography, and what fantastic photos that you actually had there. So let me move on to Chris, and maybe come back to the others. But so it's quite a lot of chat. I don't know if you've looked at it in terms of your comments on free issue. And certainly my eyebrows were raised a bit with that. Nothing's free at all. And there are costs in terms of that. And actually, going back to what I said at the start about income for farms is about a mix of the profit of what you're selling, etc., but also any payments you get. And we could be heading towards a carbon price. And we all know about the ability of sheep and cattle to add carbon to our atmosphere. So what, just to be a bit controversial and get you talking, I don't know if you've had time, you probably haven't time to look at the chat, but people basically saying grass is not free. There's management inputs, there's other inputs that actually have to go in. Do you often get challenged on that concept of free issue?
Well, yes, a lot, and it's without doubt is free. If you don't do anything with that land, it will grow and it will cost you nothing. And if you watched David Attenborough on Sunday night, he was talking about this free energy that comes from the sun, and that does not cost us anything at all. So, and we have to take that into account. And there's this equilibrium that has been created between nature and farming over centuries that has made use of this free issue. Our ancestors made use of this and understood it in a way that we don't understand it anymore. If we do nothing, we are the only industry that we can establish that has this concept of free issue. There's no other industry. Well, they all have factories. You have to invest in that factory. If you do nothing on a grassland farm, it will grow. If you get the right stocking rate, it will grow the right vegetation, the right grasses, the right meadow herbs. And then just go on to your other question, which was about income. There is a hierarchy in any business. There's a hierarchy of decision making. And what we do is that we take the support out of the output line in management accounts, not tax accounts. We take the support or any other miscellaneous income out of the output line and put it back in later on. We want to understand how it is that farms are actually working. And so we take the income from livestock, we take off the variable costs, productive variable costs, corrective variable costs, then fixed costs, and see what is left. And there's 92% of the 80 farms had no income, in fact, were significantly negative at the fixed cost level, contribution level 2. And that means that without support, there's no money to pay the farmer. And so we need to understand this because BPS is going to start going down. And unless we understand how our businesses operate without the addiction to some sort of support, we'll never be able to move forward. And it was then that we realized that the most cost-effective way to produce stock was on this free issue grass.
Okay, but grass is not something you sell. Well, you can sell hay or you could sell grazing, but actually you're getting your profits as grassland farmers from the sale of animal products. Anyway, we could go on this, and I'm not actually going to stimulate on this one. Just to remind everyone that if you want to save the chat, you can do it by bringing up the chat on the right-hand side of your screen, clicking on the 3 dots, and then actually clicking on Save Chat, and that saves it to your computer. We will also be saving it and making it available, but just if you know, tonight when you can't sleep or you want to have a look at something, you can always go back to that chat. But there are quite a lot of comments there, Chris, I think would be interesting to look at. Okay, so, but I have another question for you, Chris, about what sort of farmers? I mean, how big is your business? How many farmers are we talking about here? And there was quite a lot of talk in the chat about how do you get dairy farmers to, so what sort of farmers do you have involved? And how do you get them to buy in to your approach? Do you approach them or do they approach you? And is this something that is snowballing and building up, or is it something that's still quite low key?
Okay, I will answer those questions, but I just want to go back one stage and tell you and say to you that actually all grass is a package of energy. And what ruminants do is change that energy into a different source of fuel. All we're doing as when we're producing livestock is producing a fuel to feed ourselves. And because we're dealing in fuel, we are constrained by the laws of physics. And so you can't get more energy out than you put in. That is the second law of thermodynamics. So when you get to that point, anything that you can get for nothing to go into this, to create this fuel to feed humans, is the only way forward. So let me go on to your next question. It's all about farmers. So far, I've been employed by about 5 or 6 or maybe 7 private farm businesses. The rest have been with AOMBs, NGOs, and they have wanted to look at this process. And of course, the NGOs, the conservation NGOs, are really enthusiastic about this because they're seeing the reduction in stocking rate, which has a beneficial effect on the biodiversity. And farmers are less happy with that. They find it difficult to absorb that, quite understandably. I was taught completely other things as well. But conservationists are less happy with, but farmers are more happy with, the concept of the rewilding element is valid and completely has merit, but you need to get to MSO to make that work. And just going on to your last question, how do we get farmers involved? Very, very difficult. We're discussing this morning with a group of farmers how we get the communication strategy right for this, and it is really problematic. It's against, it's counterintuitive, against the received wisdom, and yet, and I can't repeat this enough, every single one of the 80 farms has produced the same characteristics, every one. Now that, I think, to be statistically significant, you need 28 sets of data. We've got nearly 80. And so we have to persuade farmers to drive their businesses through profit without support and create product through selling added value meat, and also selling a product in the form of natural capital.
Okay, thanks for that. Do any of the other speakers want to come back on any of these points or pick up on what other speakers said before I hand back to Kirsty? Ian, you looked ready to say something.
Just mention one point. They want about the British Grassland Society offers a lot of advice. The Pasture Fed group has a wonderful Google group where as so much information gets passed across, you just type a question in and so many people come back with free information on that as to how it can be done.
Great, thanks for that. So we live in a sharing society. Help is at the end of a Google search or a whatever else search that you might actually want to be. The information is out there and there's lots of advice, and I would encourage people to get in touch if there's points that they want to follow up from this, to follow them up with individuals or to go back to BGS or BSAS. These webinars have proven quite popular over time, and hopefully we'll keep going on with them regardless of what happens with lockdown, which we hope before too long might actually be lifted. So let's say thank you again to the speakers for excellent talks and hand you back to Kirsty to sum up.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Thank you very much, Maggie. Oops. No, sorry, I thought I was on mute there. Thank you very much for that question and discussion session. I would like to firstly thank the speakers for some excellent presentations tonight. They have taken us through a journey of the history of the schemes that have been put in place to support biodiversity in our farmland. And Claire has illustrated that the schemes have become much more ambitious as we've moved over time. So from the early days of the 1980s right through to now, they've become much more ambitious in terms of what they're trying to do. It was very clear from Claire's presentation and the discussion session afterwards that actually the relationship between the advisor and the farmer, and also between farmers in terms of getting biodiversity schemes more embedded in our farming systems, is critical to making that work. It's also clear that there's been a lot of work done over the years on the practical information and to show what works and what doesn't work in terms of actually improving the biodiversity. And also, Claire made the point that in the recent trials that payments by results has changed practices. So there's a clear message there about making sure that actually you're paying by results in terms of moving things forward. Ian and Chris have both showed us how they can farm grassland to deliver biodiversity. And they both talked about farming as a conversation with nature. And it is clear that actually to improve our biodiversity, we must actually remember that and bring that into discussions and practices. And farming in those ways not only improves the biodiversity, but improves the soil health and will have implications for soil carbon. They also illustrated the importance that farming has to be viable, but we have to do that in conjunction with nature. It's about farming for a long-term sustainability of our systems. As Maggie has said, you can download the chat. You might also be interested in attending the British Society of Animal Science Conference, which is being held virtually this year from the 12th to the 15th of April. And more details can be found on their website. The Stapleton Trust is sponsoring a session at the conference, and that is entitled The Potential Contribution of Livestock to Addressing the Twin Emergencies of Climate Change and Biodiversity Loss. And finally, I would like to acknowledge again the funders for the event, the British Grassland Society, the Stapleton Trust, and BSES, and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much.